Welcome to those of you on this call, and there are people who, every so often are still joining us. Basically, tonight, and we are recording this, we're going to do a total update of everything. And our two issue specialists in this area, Susie Kaeser and Cynthia Peoples, will be doing this. We do have the slides in the shared drive, so you can revisit the slides, and I will send out this recording to everyone, because I do know there were a few people, like the Canton people said this was a freak occurrence, that this month they have these conflicts, and that shouldn't happen after that. We'll see where that goes. So tonight's whole purpose is to get us all on the same page. We are assuming nothing. So we are going to do, Susie will be starting. We will go through positions and bills and State Board of Education, and then talk about what we consider the options for advocacy. On May 23rd, we will pick up with the options for advocacy, and we will talk about the working groups that we're going to form, so that we divide this huge group into smaller groups that work on different pieces that are needed. And some of those pieces will be questions for candidates forums, meetings to have with State Board of Reps after the election, how to arrange that, why we arrange that, what you can talk about, what you can ask them to get to know them and where they stand on issues. So we will take things like social emotional learning and, the whole child framework, etc., and put it in a way that you can ask questions to see where your state Board of Education rep stands on the issue, and possibly share where league stands on the issue in a conversation, but starting with learning who they are. So we'll probably be doing that. We will form some take action groups to work in terms of messaging, to have meetings with state reps, both senators and House members, after the election. So, summer's a good time to do this because we're not going crazy advocating with the bills. And so we can sit back and really think it through. How do you do that? And we already have some tools on the website, but what I've always found with local leagues, the specifics are important. How do you ask the right question? Where do you start? Like ours here, Christina Rogner, our senator, she started getting to know me when she was in the House, and I know about her kids. I know where they go to school. So I usually make connections because I know something about her, and I know how to connect it into what she thinks is important. So we'll need people to create those guidelines for local leagues, etc. So with that, I am going to first, since there's so few of us, just go around with names. So obviously I'm Karen Lathan. I'm your state chair for advocacy. Cynthia Peoples in the corner will be introducing herself when she gets to the pieces on the honesty and the state board. And she's our issue specialist, and she is the founding director of Honesty for Ohio Education, which is our newest coalition, which is absolutely incredible. And she's a powerhouse. And Susie Kaeser has been a learn by the seat of your pants, bite your way into it, issue specialist on vouchers and education finance, and her wealth of information is incredible, and her network is incredible in terms of that. So that's, and then Pam Wilson is from Licking County, and Pam is a member of our advocacy committee. So with that, I'm going to ask Holly, why don't you tell people who you are?
Okay, I'm Holly Norton. I'm president of the Lima, or the League of Women Voters of the Lima area. I teach English at the University of Northwestern Ohio. And so,
Ellen, can you tell us a little bit, a couple sentences about you?
Yes, I am a retired professor from Miami University where I taught art, and I'm from the Oxford, Ohio League, where I'm the social portfolio policy director. I've only been in position a year, so thank you.
Good job.
Great. Sarah?
Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Stitzline, and I am a professor at the University of Cincinnati in the College of Education, where I teach teachers.
And we will be sending you an article that Sarah wrote recently that she has gladly shared with us to send you to read before our next meeting. Pat?
Well, I'm Pat Simpson, and I've been retired from education. I was a high school guidance counselor and a drug-free coordinator for school, Geneva schools, where I live. I did that for 35 years. And so I've been retired almost 16 years now. And I taught at Kent State University as well as Lakeland Community College, child development. And the one at Kent was the Introduction to Education. I developed a course curriculum and we did it. It was a practical thing, getting people to their first year of being in education, getting out into the schools rather than waiting till the last year and then they find out they don't like it.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Thank
the other thing that I have that, you know, I might have to offer that's more up to date is that my daughter is in a consultants group. They're all over the United States, and they consult with college professors and help them with any needs they have as far as communication or curriculum. And she went to Syracuse University, and so I'm hoping maybe through that way I can have some things to add.
Thank you. And is it Nikki or
Ellen.
It is. It's Nikki. Hi, how are you all? I'm Nikki Marchman Boykin. I'm with the Akron League. I was invited by Jackie Darrow because I'm a 28-year educator with Kent City Schools, and I teach American government and the Black experience, which is a dual college credit plus and college preparatory course at Roosevelt High School. So this a lot of what Cynthia, hi, we haven't met formally. Her husband and I were in diversity on board together. A lot of what I do is very much steeped into what's going on. So I'm extremely in tune. Also, my sorority, Sigma Gamma Rho Sorority Incorporated, we will host, all of the Ohio chapters will host a day at the State Square on May 25th. So this is very timely for me so that I know what to do once we go down there. And we definitely will address 322, 327, and 616.
Thank you so much, Nikki. Nice having all of you. With that, I'm going to share my screen and turn it over to Susie to start us.
So I'm going to talk the league. For those of you who are new to the league, or I jumped into the state education role about 3 years ago, and I didn't know, even though I've been a league member for 20 years, I didn't know anything about how things function in the league. And one of the first things you learn is that if you want to advocate on legislation, you can only advocate if it's a topic that the league has taken a position on. And a position is reported in something called the Agenda for Action. And positions are, it's not like we get together and say, we're for or against this piece of legislation. What the league does is it studies an issue, a substantive issue, and then takes a position based on substantive research. And one of the things about the league, many of you as academics appreciate the importance of research. And perhaps the most impressive thing about the league and the place where it gets its credentials is that everything is based on research. So we try to be a highly informed, take positions that are highly informed after extensive discussion. Every subject that gets studied for which there's a report, and then the positions come out in the report, then every league member has a chance to vote on whether or not they support those positions. So we are deeply a grassroots organization, which I think is extremely powerful. And so our positions are, people have come to agreement that this is what we stand for, so that when you go to speak for the league and represent the views of the league, you are actually speaking on issues that people agree are important, and that we can take a position, we can then comment on the legislation and whether or not it supports our position. So it's extremely, I think it's a very impressive process that the league uses. It can be really long, but that's what's really, but it is really based in important research. Now, in the education agenda is a little fragmented, and I would say it's outdated in many ways, because a lot of it was developed before the war on public education began. So many of our positions were formulated in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, and a lot has happened since then. And so when I joined the league, or took this position on 3 years ago, I came into it because I was so upset with high stakes testing. And we did not have any kind of position on high stakes testing. So I was fortunate to have a great mentor in Marianne Barnes, who's our local chapter. And we went through doing the study and doing a consensus from a different state's process. In any case, we were able to come to some positions on that. So I'm going to review just briefly what's in our agenda for action related to primary and secondary education. And then we also have a section on higher education. And many of you are from higher education, including Pam. And I know we don't do very much around that. The other thing that is wonderful about the league is that the interests of its members can drive action. So if we have somebody who's really interested in following higher education, we could be more active around it. Of course, the other thing that determines action is whether or not the legislature is paying any attention. So for several years, some of the issues that I cared about, nothing was happening on, and now lots is happening. So that's a couple of observations that I wanted to make about really about our positions. And one is that they tend to focus on governance questions, and they also do a lot. We also spend a lot of time thinking about how you spend money and what's an appropriate use of public funds. That's just a pattern I've seen in a lot of our positions. I also want to say that the budget bill is really important, because an awful lot of state policy, especially related to education, gets built into the budget, whether it has financial repercussions or not. So the budget process itself is we need to pay a lot of attention there, because that's where the real decisions are made. However, the budget process is often very opaque. And so at times it can be extremely discouraging, because in the dark of night, lots of horse trading is done and a lot of policy is passed without any kind of public comment. So it's another thing I've learned from doing this. Another thing I've learned is that a lot of bills don't go anywhere. So some really good legislation will be introduced. It will either not get assigned to a committee, or a committee will never hold a hearing on it. So the other thing is that we have to conserve our energy, and you focus on things that can go somewhere. But that's another important part of the advocacy process. So the other thing that I'm very aware of is that there's a very well-funded effort to dismantle public education, and there's not a very well-funded effort to protect it. And our voices as the league are extremely important here. And we've seen in a lot of Cynthia's work that just by having her present and by being able to bring up an issue and challenge it publicly, we've been able, like the way in which DeWine reconfigured the state board districts, all of a sudden that became a hot issue. And it's because she got voices to speak to it. So just to say that we are the civic voice, and it's very important, and we are all volunteers here. So it's, we're fighting against some very difficult opposition. So that's my 2 cents on the big picture. So here's one of the things that really thrills me. The League of Women Voters US, this is the national position, has as one of its stated principles, right along with every citizen should be protected in the right to vote, is that every person should have access to free public education that provides equal opportunity for all. So public education is a basic principle. A commitment to our public system of education is an expressed position of the League of Women Voters US. So that right there gives it a high level of status and significance. Okay, Karen? School funding is, of course, one of our primary focuses and has been forever, since 1930, I think, was when we first got involved, maybe 1921. But we know that, so one of our primary positions is that we're committed to getting school funding to be constitutional. And fortunately, in the last 4 years, there's been real motion and movement on that. So these are very specific qualities that describe what that is. And so it's very interesting to me that all of our positions on fair school funding were developed in the 1990s, before and after the DeRolf case. And all of the things, you want to move to the next one, many of the qualifications that were that we asked for have actually been built in to the Fair School Funding Plan, which I think is really, really wonderful that we understood early on what it takes to have a constitutional system. And the good news is that the Fair School Funding Plan actually does all of those things. It has been partially passed in the last budget bill, but we still have to get it over the finish line by getting it fully funded. It did all these things. Okay, Karen.
Oops, wait a second. No, something happened. Come on. There we go.
So our positions speak to another big area, which is the use of public funds for private education. And we know that vouchers are one of the big examples of using public funds for private education. But I think it's really great. In 1991, the League of Women Voters passed this position that we believe that public funds should be used only for public schools. And that was introduced by Donaline Podeska, who is from Cleveland Heights, which is where I'm from. And she was she was on the board of the nonprofit that I used to direct. Anyway, so this is a very strong position staked out very early before we were moving much money to private education. But we do have a private school funding program in the state that's separate from vouchers that gives private schools resources for administration and transportation. So it's quite interesting that we have a standing program there, and we have opposed any increase in state aid to those programs, and we oppose those programs. So we're quite clear in our opposition our position that public funds should be for public education. Then we have the charter school question, and Karen led the group that actually passed something that addressed charter schools. And their position did not challenge whether or not a charter school was a public school. They took the position that it is a public school because it receives public funds. Although since then, it's really become more questionable whether it really is a public school. But the position that we are very strong about is that if you accept public money, you should, the institution that receives it should be accountable and responsive to the public through elected boards of education. and should comply with the standards that ensure a high quality education. So what's basically saying is, if you're a public entity, then you need to be governed the same way a public school is. The elected board of your local district should have, you should be accountable to them, and they should have authority over a lot of your decisions. So that is not the case. And I think it's by focusing on governance, we've done a very good job of sticking to the principles of the league, which that elected boards are incredibly important for local accountability for the public use of public money. So our position on charter schools is really around accountability questions. So the second position, that the locally elected school board is constitutionally established to provide oversight and direction to the educational system in each district. I think that's a principle that we understand, and that gives us, in some cases, a basis for looking at other issues where we need to make sure that the school board voice is the voice that makes decisions. So I think we're very supportive of local control of a lot of the issues having to do with the actual implementation of education. But again, that's really referring to the charter school side, but I think it also applies to education in general. So the next area that's been a high priority has been this test-based accountability and high stakes testing. We know that when high stakes testing began in 2001 with No Child Left Behind, it completely changed education in every classroom in every school district across the country. And part of the reason is because so many consequences were tied to the results of tests. And the research really shows that that's an inappropriate use of standardized tests. They are not robust enough to make the kind of decisions and judgments that lawmakers in Ohio have insisted on tying to the results of aggregated test scores. So I'm really happy that we've been very clear that they shouldn't be used for grade promotion and graduation, and that they shouldn't be used for evaluating teachers or administration. And that's really, our state report card is used to evaluate the quality of a whole school district based on test results, which is, and it's also used to trigger state takeover of school districts. So these are very harsh consequences that are based on a flimsy and inappropriate measurement, which is more of a measurement of the income of test takers than it is of the quality of education. So the third one, that funding should not be linked to standardized test performance. Test scores have been used to trigger Ed Choice vouchers. And Ed Choice vouchers took money away from school districts. So this speaks to that phenomenon, although that is, now that we do direct funding of vouchers, it's not linked to test scores, although in the long run it is. And the final thing that we addressed was the whole frequency of testing, which is what was killing an awful lot of people no matter what the consequences are. So I feel like we have a pretty robust position on this that allows us to address a lot of the legislation that's designed to either punish district or to end that process. So we do have an area in higher education, and it mostly has been about the role of the Board of Regents. And the other thing that it is very specific about is really what school funding, what the state funding should provide for, which they've stopped doing, is a basic level support for all the state public higher ed, some support for capital improvements, and support for scholarships. So those are the three things that we've staked out as being the important focus for what we'd be watching in the state budget around higher ed. So let me do a quick review on what's happening with what legislation is now pending. So the Fair School Funding Plan, which was partially adopted in House Bill 110 in the last budget, which was passed in June of 21, is sitting there now, waiting for the next legislature to be installed in 2023. And that legislature, when they take up the budget a year from now, in June, they will be the ones that determine what finally happens with House Bill 110. So it's really important. And we know that all the House seats are up for election, and it's a third of the Senate seats are up for election. And then we have a significant number of term limited legislators. So the people who are going to determine whether fair school funding actually becomes a reality will be people who we are going to be electing now. And a lot of them will be new players, and we have no idea whether or not they're committed to public education, have the will to spend the money that's existing, that's available to spend on education. So it's a wide open, just an unknown future. So for our advocacy at this point, it's really making sure that we know every candidate, we know where they stand on fair school funding, that we educate them about fair school funding, and that we don't go away. So a recent piece of legislation that was just passed is this House Bill 126, which was creating a solution to a problem that didn't exist, which has been approved by the governor. So, but it basically makes it difficult for local boards of education to challenge changes in assessed valuation of property, which just will mean that more homeowners are going to have to spend more to make up for reduction in local tax revenue from other sources. House Bill 290 is also known as the backpack bill. It's really ending our notion of school funding as being funding a system of education, and it becomes a universal voucher program, which would be just a disaster for us. It's a total rejection of the principles of a public system that serves everybody. Another piece of, and that one's sitting there, and we don't know if it's going to go anywhere. It would cause a huge increase in spending on education, which would be to the detriment of spending for the public system, because anybody who attends a private school at this point would have access to a significant amount of state aid to pay for their private education, including homeschooling. So House Bill 323 this is a tax credit for homeschooling. It's, again, another departure into funding something we've never funded before. So, and the other thing that is sitting out there, which is not legislation, but it is this lawsuit, the Vouchers for Ohio lawsuit, which challenges the constitutionality of our voucher system, of the Ed Choice voucher program. And really it's basing it on, you can't really operate two systems. This is quite different from the last constitutional challenge, the Zellman case, that challenged the voucher program, because that was really based on the separation of church and state, and they're not using that as the issue at all. And the remedy to this, unlike the school funding case, which required the legislature to change the funding system, which is a pretty hard thing to mandate, this remedy basically says it's illegal to write those checks. So it's a stopping action instead of a stimulating action. So it's something that if it were, if they won it, it would actually fundamentally change this. So it's really important. And there is now a concerted drive to go to local school districts and to by privatizers to tell them not to join the lawsuit. And for now, I think they're having trouble generating. They'd like to have like 400 districts join the lawsuit, and many are reluctant to do it. I think partly not understanding that you could actually win this, not understanding that school districts are not independent agents, but they are part of a system of public schools, and that this may not appear to be about them, but it is about them. So at any rate, some of our advocacy is focused on trying to get our local school districts who have not joined the suit to do so. In the high stakes testing area, there's some good legislation sitting out there. One would end the academic distress commissions, that's when you have the state takeover based on test scores. I'm very unclear whether that piece of legislation would go anywhere, but it would remedy one of the bad high stakes outcomes. The budget bill there are 3 school districts that are in state receivership, East Cleveland, Lorraine, and Youngstown, and the budget bill did give them a process for getting out of receivership. So that may be a temporary relief, or it may not solve anything. And House Bill 497, so Gail Manning is the one that's introduced both of these, and she's the chair of the House Education Committee, and she is a former educator herself. And so she introduced legislation that is called the fourth grade guarantee, which requires kids who do not pass the standardized test to be retained in 3rd grade. And she clearly recognizes that a 3rd grader taking a standardized test, having any decision based on that would be totally inappropriate. So those are good bills, which I have no idea whether they'll go anywhere, but that's what I'll be watching. And do you want to speak to the arming school personnel bill, Karen?
Just really quickly, this is a bill that's atrocious because it would allow school districts to arm school personnel without any real training. And it was because of the Supreme Court case that basically said anyone armed in the school had to at least have the SRO training. So it did pass the House, even though there was a lot of opposition from many of the police departments, et cetera, and it's now in the Senate. And so we're closely watching it. It came out of our position on this, which opposes the arming of school personnel, came out of one of our most recent studies.
Yeah. Then the final thing, I think this is the final piece that I was following, and that is, charter schools in Ohio, we allow charter school operators to operate on a for-profit basis, and they have been the most corrupt of any of them. And so this would eliminate the for-profit charter school option. And that would, I think that would be an extremely important piece of progress. So, and again, I think this is a Gail Manning bill. So that it's, yeah. So there are some positive things there, but I think they are completely they're just overshadowed by those ridiculous distraction stuff that that Cynthia will tell you about. So thanks for listening. And if you need any more details, any more understanding, but I hope that gives you a sense of the range of issues that we're able to cover because we have positions on them.
All yours, Cynthia.
All right, everybody. Hi, my name is Cynthia Peoples, and my origin story with the League is that I actually started with the League of Hudson and then quickly escalated up to the League of Ohio. And I have the pleasure and honor of sitting on a couple of state committees, one, the Advocacy Committee with my sister Karen Leith, and the other, the DEI Committee, which is led by Pam, who's also on the call. And Pam and Karen, for those of you that don't know, are some of the hardest working women in the League of Ohio. So you are really in good company. They cover just a large swath of League issues, operationally and policy wise. So what I'm going to do as far as education goes is just walk you through some of the honesty and education issues, and just quickly before I step into Ohio, just to put on your radar that 42 states across the country have introduced or passed legislation that censors, restricts, bans honest education addressing race, sex, sexuality, and gender identity. And here in Ohio, we have 3 of those bills. And more broadly, these attacks against public education that Susie so aptly called it really started as a whiplash effect to the summer of 2020. That really was a flashpoint after the murder of George Floyd, and really called for all of us here in this country and internationally to really have this racial reckoning with how we have addressed racial issues and how we do not address racial issues. And there was a firm call to action, and many Americans across the country started looking at how they themselves dealt with racialized issues, and how their businesses, how their schools, how their local communities, local governments address these issues, and really started taking a firm action to move or to cause this cultural shift to happen. And when I say there was a whiplash to that, is that the white dominant power structures didn't like this immediate action that was happening. And there was an immediate backlash to movements in democracy, to movements in education, to movements in business, movements in funding and housing and public health, that were all taking this broad action. And right now, education is in the collateral damage for this. And one of the sweeping movements we saw were efforts to stop honest education, as far as looking at how racism actually impacts education, and continues to shape and inform our institutions. And here in Ohio, like I said, we have 3 bills. I won't go into the heavy details about what each of these do. I did want to put this information up on the screen so that you could look at the differences between the 3. 616 is the newest bill that was introduced in April. What I can tell you about this is it does have 2 primary co-sponsors. It has not been assigned to a committee yet. And 616 specifically prohibits divisive and inherently racist concepts, and defines those divisive and inherently racist concepts as critical race theory, intersectional theory, the 1619 Project, DEI learning outcomes, inherited racial guilt. This would be notions of white guilt and white privilege, and then also any other concepts defined by the State Board of Education. It also specifically prohibits education and discussion about sexual orientation and gender identity in K through 3, and then requires that any type of education around that be age appropriate and developmentally appropriate for grades 4 through 12. Now, this education about sexual orientation and gender identity was imported from Florida's recently passed Don't Say Gay bill. So when you hear Ohio has a new Don't Say Gay bill, please do not advertise this and promote this as Ohio's Don't Say Gay bill. We have to talk about the intersectional harm that this bill produces. This is more than a homophobic, transphobic bill. This has intersectional harm in here, and we need to not be tone deaf about the other harm that this bill is causing in Ohio. What's unique about 616 is that the primary sponsors of this bill did not shop around for signatures and co-sponsors like the other 2 bills did. This bill was brought in quickly. From what we understand, it wasn't even shopped around with the House Speaker, which is why it was not immediately assigned to a committee yet. And it may or may not be assigned to a committee because of how quickly it was brought into the State House. The other difference with 616 is 616 is the only bill that specifically identifies and prohibits critical race theory. If you look at 327 and 322, it does not call out critical race theory, the 1619 Project, diversity, equity, and inclusion, learning outcomes. So 616 is the shortest of the 3 bills, but it does specifically identify these issues, which have become trigger terms for the greater community. Now, jumping over to 327, or excuse me, let me jump back to 616. 616 only hits our K-12 schools also. So now jumping over to 327 and 322, both of these bills were introduced at the same time in May of 21. The primary sponsors of both of these bills shopped it around the State House and were able to get co-sponsors. So both of these bills enjoy a tremendous amount of support from conservatives in the State House. Now, the difference between 327 and 322 is 327 is the most broad of the three bills. And you can see 327 directly targets our K-12 schools. And very recently, it now includes our publics, our STEM schools, our community schools, our non-publics, and our charters. So this is very broad and very sweeping. It also includes our state higher education institutions. It also includes our state agencies, our state retirement systems, and our political subdivisions. Now, the state agency and political subdivision aspects are really important because this goes beyond what is happening on our campuses and in our classrooms. This specifically impacts our law enforcement agencies, our police departments, our sheriff's departments, our public libraries, our public health, our county health departments. So our local government systems. So when we're talking about 327 and what 327 prohibits as far as DEI training, anti-bias training, anti-racism training, professional development, and being able to use public funds to train our staff and our educators, it is really important that we zero in on these state agencies and political subdivisions, because when we're talking about police training and police reform and addressing racialized policing and fatalistic racialized policing, this is going to pull a lot of that training off of the table for those police departments. When we're talking about public health aspect and we're talking about our county health departments being able to zero in on access to public health and the quality of care that our different marginalized communities are actually enjoying or not enjoying, taking this training and this professional development off the table is going to stop a lot of the progression that we've been able to make, which is nearly not enough, but at least we've started to make a shift there. And this bill would put that to a stop. Looking it over at 322. 322 is the more narrow of those two bills, and it only hits our K-12 districts. Now, 327 and 322, like I said, they do not specifically call out critical race theory. What they do is limit, restrict, and censor how race, sex, sexism, notions of systemic racism in our country, the legacies of systemic racism, how those are able to be taught and discussed in the classroom. And like I said, how they are able to be trained. So when we're talking about training educators to be culturally responsive in the classroom, this would put a stop to that as well. And how 327 specifically says that school districts would have to come up with approved lists of topics for teachers and educators to be able to discuss and teach in the classroom, so that it would put together a short list of what was being able to be discussed and taught there. It specifically impacts model curricula standards. 327 goes on to define sex, as meaning biological sex. So 327 and 322 also have some very targeted language as far as hitting our LGBTQ plus communities, our students and our educators. It says that districts do not have to require that our educators and staff use gender affirming pronouns. They do not have to affirm the existence of multiplicity of gender identities, specifically calling out our trans student, our trans educators. So when we're talking about 616 being the Don't Say Gay bill, we have very anti-LGBTQ plus tenets in all three of these bills. It's just that 616 brings in specific language that was in the Florida bill. So again, when we're talking about all three of these bills, we have to talk about the intersectional harm, and that all three of them are homophobic and transphobic. So if we want to advance to the next slide, just quickly here. So this is really capturing where each of these bills are right now. 327 has 27 co-sponsors right now. 322 is the bill that has probably had the least amount of activity, really. And like I said, 322 and 327, they're both sitting in the state and local government committee. It got some legs to it when we had the hearing back in September for both 322 and 327, but it just hasn't gotten a lot of movement since then. If you look at 327 has a bit more co-sponsors, 34 there, and that's in the committee that it's sitting in and across the state house. 327 has gone through 12 different revisions. So these primary sponsors are really trying to get 327 across the finish line, and they keep giving it all of these facelifts. It's still as toxic and as ugly as it was when they first brought it into the state house. In fact, what they're doing now is just making it worse by broadening the different schools that it's actually impacting now. They're just kind of retooling some of the language, but the elements of the spirit, it is still there. That hasn't been removed or edited out of the bill. The committee members and the primary sponsors were actively trying to get 327 out of the state and local government committee all the way up until, I'd say, about a month ago, when Rep. Sarah Fowler Arthur, who is one of the primary co-sponsors, made some pretty outrageous and repugnant remarks about the Holocaust. And that pretty much brought 327 to a screeching halt. Speaker Cupp even came out and basically reprimanded Sarah Fowler Arthur for her remarks and said that he didn't agree with the remarks that were made. So what's interesting is around the time when Sarah Fowler Arthur made her remarks, a few weeks after that is when 616 got introduced into the state house. So there's a sense that maybe 616 is kind of picking up on where 327 left off. Part of the issues with 327 was that it was so broad. So there were a lot of legislators, a lot of infighting going on within the state house. Some folks didn't like that higher ed was implicated in it. Some folks didn't like that the non-publics were implicated in it as far as K-12 goes. So they just couldn't, they had a tough time moving it out of the committee. 616, because it's so narrow and it really defines what it is it's prohibiting, there's a sense among some that this one may be easier to move across the finish line, and it's speaking to a very specific base. So, I mean, this may actually get some traction because it's got all the good campaign trigger words in there. Like I said, it hasn't been assigned to a committee yet. It does not have any co-sponsors, and we are watching this bill closely.
Can I add something here, Cynthia? Sarah Fowler Arthur, who's the author of those bills, is also the author of the backpack bill and the tax credit for homeschooling. She is a homeschooled person who homeschooled her children, who is absolutely opposed to public education. So I don't know if she's doing this for to help the political cause, or this is just fundamentally where she comes from, which is anti-public.
It's where she comes from. She actually is from our area, and I followed her for 20 years or more.
Yeah, Ashtabula. Yep.
And then I think she caused, there was a lot of problems in Painesville Township District. I think or maybe she lived in that district or whatever, but it started a long time ago. Same kind of issues that she was, the homeschooling type stuff.
Yeah, and thanks for that, Susie and Pat. And what you'll see here with this menu of attacks against public education is you'll see a lot of the same primary sponsors, and you'll see many similar co-sponsors, if not the exact same people with their signatures and their footprints and handprints all over these bills. The two primary sponsors that are on the new bill 616 have their handprints all over these additional bills that you see here also. Rep Loychik is one of the primary sponsors for 616. And he's also the primary sponsor for House Bill 582, which is a third one you see here, which is reducing the school board terms from 4 years to 2 years and trying to turn school board races into partisan elections, which right now, both our state board races and our local school board races are nonpartisan elections because we don't want politics entering education. We don't want that intersection. So yeah, I mean, he's on a rant right now. And I'll tell you, one of the reasons that he introduced 582 is because he didn't like the success that a lot of our pro-honesty, pro-equity, pro-DEI candidates enjoyed in the last school board races. So because he couldn't remove them out of their candidate seats or out of their school board seats, he's trying to move to make their terms shorter so they can't serve as long as they would in a 4-year term. And looking at House Bill 454, this is an anti-LGBTQ plus bill that essentially bans gender affirming care and treatment for minors. We're talking about any kind of hormonal treatment, any kind of physical reaffirming surgery. We're talking about counseling, we're talking about therapy, but it goes beyond that as well. It also requires our educators and staff to out those students to their families if they find out that they have a non-cis sexual identity, gender identity at school. The obvious harm there. And then House Bill 529 is another great bill that requires all of our K-12 public educators to upload all of their syllabi, their lessons, their teaching materials, textbooks, handouts, anything you can think of. I see you laughing. Anything you can think of, they have to upload that to their district's website before the school year starts, and then they have to keep it updated. So each time their lesson plans change, flex, recede throughout the week, they're responsible for keeping that website updated. And what this is doing is it's designed to create a pipeline for this very aggressive assault against public education to police educators and to call out educators for any material in their class that can be seen as indoctrinating their students, that can be seen as critical race theory, that can be seen as not being colorblind in education. It's creating a channel for those families. And then Senate Bill 214 is actually one that we're in favor of, if you can believe it. And Senate Bill 214 is a bill that's requiring our K-12 districts to teach Asian American Pacific Islander curriculum. And we're looking at this one as being a roadmap and a template for other culturally inclusive curriculum that we can build as sister legislation once we get this one across the finish line. And our AAPI focused advocacy orgs are piggybacking off of the success in Illinois, because they just were recently able to pass this AAPI bill in their state, and we're looking to pattern what they did here in Ohio and create a chain reaction. We do have some culturally inclusive education already in our state standards. AAPI is not one of them, which is why this bill was put together. And then looking at the State Board of Education, we are closely watching the hiring of our new state superintendent, which is very likely going to happen tomorrow. The board accepted about 27 different candidate applications, narrowed it down to a short list of 7, and then last week narrowed that list down to a shorter list of 3. And they will be conducting interviews today and likely voting on those candidates tomorrow. So we should have a new state superintendent there. We are also closely watching what happens to our existing Each Child, Our Future Department of Ed strategic plan. Now, this plan was a 5-year plan, and it is set to expire in 2024. But what we want to do is in the next draft of the strategic plan, which our new state super will help draft. We want to be sure that it still lifts and highlights the whole child framework and still includes social emotional learning and includes equity as one of the 3 core principles for the strategic plan, which with the makeup of the state board right now, there's a pretty good amount of the state board members that actually want to pull social emotional learning from our state standards. And they want to remove equity as a core principle from our strategic plan. And they have some serious issues with the whole child framework. So this is something that we're closely watching, and depending on who comes in as our next state superintendent, they may actually be an instrument to help remove some of these standards. And then finally, the next thing that we're closely watching that Susie and Karen hit on is the redistricting of our State Board of Education maps. Our State Board of Education gets redistricted with our state and congressional maps. We did see some gerrymandering of the most recent attempt that Governor DeWine did with those State Board of Ed maps that was really smelling like political retribution for our state board members that voted against repealing the anti-racism and equity resolution. For those of you not aware, our state board president and another appointed member were asked to resign for refusing to repeal that resolution. And then the 4 remaining elected members were essentially gerrymandered out of their districts with this most recent redistricting of the State Board of Ed maps. Now that redistricting, that reapportionment depended on the state maps that will ultimately be accepted, because those state board districts are redrawn according to our Senate boundaries. So we're still waiting to see what's going to happen with that. And we do encourage everyone to pay attention to the state board meetings, which happen every first and second Monday and Tuesday of the month. And then here are just some quick advocacy options, just to build awareness in your own local league, hold informational events, write those op-eds and letters to the editor, take advantage of our local media, and learn about candidates, learn about where our candidates stand on these issues, their positions, if they're sponsors, if they're primary sponsors on these issues, and build relationships with your own local officials so that you can get into their ears, because all of our local officials have relationships with other elected folks that are driving some of this legislation. And then stay updated. You can definitely plug into the vouchers, Hurt Ohio. Please pay attention to what's happening with Honesty for Ohio Education. Vouchers Hurt Ohio and Honesty. I mean, we're talking about the funding, and we're talking about the honest teaching of these issues in all of our campuses and our districts. And then stay engaged. Just pay attention to the emails, the action alerts, and the updates that are shared throughout all of these different mailing lists. Respond to those action alerts, and then to be sure to share those out in your leagues, in your own networks, your personal networks, and be sure to bring your own concerns and updates on issues into the education committee. You guys, all of us are the ears in the ground, the eyes and ears on the ground to be able to bring that information back here.
Well, I hope you got a good sense of what we've been doing and why we need this education committee. That last chart and the working groups will be where we pick up on May 23rd. Watch for an email in the next 2 days that will outline basically what we're hoping to do. And again, you can see why we promised you can have access to these slides, and for the next 30 days at least, this recording, and that recording will be in the email. And the slides now exist in the shared drive under the folder May 9th. You'll see the PowerPoint there. We've been doing a lot of work, and we're really counting on the ability of this larger group to basically form some smaller groups that can help us with the work we're trying to do. It's a lot of work. And for the first time too, if you notice, we're paying a lot of attention to the State Board of Education, which has added a whole nother layer on, and we've had to help a lot of leagues in creating better relationships with their local boards of education. So these issues are cutting across multiple levels, which is why we need every single one of you. And we really are hoping that local leagues can jump in with forming those important relationships. You know, if we're going to have any success, it's magnifying our voices, finding local allies, and meeting with as constituents of your state board reps and your local, basically school boards, as well as your members of the General Assembly. That's what ultimately makes a difference. We started this now so that we have time to work over the summer. So when we are in the heat of election season, you will have all the tools you need to ask the right questions at forums, to use those questions, to pose. We do that a lot here in Hudson. We'll write a letter deliberately to pose questions that should be asked of candidates, to bring issues to the fore. Cynthia, you want to add something?
Yeah, I want to emphasize what Karen said about paying attention to the State Board of Education, because the State Board of Education has become an arm of the State House. There is no separation there. In fact, the Senate has been using and stacking the State Board of Education to do its work. And as we're looking around what's happening nationally, we're seeing the State Board of Education doing the bidding of a lot of these state houses. So the legislation that isn't being passed in the State House is being exercised in the state boards of education. For instance, Virginia, Governor Youngkin is trying to pass a very similar bill to the 454, outing students in their State Board of Education. So we have that in our State House, and it is in their State Board of Education. And we have seen a lot of this interplay. I mean, so some of it sits over here, some of it sits over there. And the voting power of the State Board of Education right now is anti-equity and is anti-racism and is anti-student wellness. It is anti-behavioral health. So we have to pay attention to the State Board of Education, and especially with the redistricting of the State Board of Education, the sinisterness of this redistricting goes beyond who we're putting into our state house and in our local government. Like, all of this is intersecting right now in a way that a lot of people can't even imagine that what is going on. And the state board races this year are very, they're always important. But right now, the 5 members that are up for re-election in November at the State Board of Education are the 5 that were leading the charge to repeal the anti-racism resolution, and are the 5 that are leading the charge to remove social emotional learning from the State Board of Education. We cannot go out and oppose or endorse any candidate. This is just facts. We can look up the voting record. So please do not go into your communities and tell people to vote against these candidates. All we can do is put forth the information, and those are facts right now. So it's really important to have communication with these state board reps. I mean, some of them, from what we understand, are open to conversations and others are not. Nikki Tim Miller is one of the ones up for election in November at the state board, who's our Akron rep. Yeah,
And Hudson's being folded into that district, at least the last time, given, what they've been doing. So those are things. And so it's worth doing this. And we're going to talk a lot more about that, about these working groups moving toward the election and what needs to be done at the May 23rd meeting. And so we will emphasize all of this with those who can make the May 23rd meeting. Susie, we're over time, so
Just one thing, and maybe Cynthia, you can help. We could put out the list of who is standing for election at the state board level and where they represent, so people in our group know if they're affected by those people or not. And the other thing I want to say is just simply that I think historically we've focused very much on the legislature. And now the war is going in a different direction. It's going up to the state board and it's going down to the local school board. And one thing that all of us can do is we need to know which school boards are being attacked and where this is happening. And we need to be really, as listeners and reporters about that. And we need to start thinking about how to fight that. So that's, those are other directions to go. We focus today on state legislation, but a lot of it isn't happening there at all. And I think it's important to remember that.
right.
Right,
And
and when we talk
observer
about local
corps and
control-
observing local school boards has never been so important.
yeah, and when we talk about protecting local control, even if these bills don't go through with the state house, because of local control, these things can still be exercised in our local school boards. Yeah.
Thank you all for attending. I hope this was worthwhile for you tonight. And feel free to always give us feedback, because we want to shape meetings. And as I said from the very beginning, the advocacy committee itself meets in this same time slot, the third Monday of every month. So if you have a concern or you have a need, feel free to email me. Because we can always discuss it at the regular advocacy meeting. This is becoming really important, and we're so glad that you've all joined us and are willing to help us on this. And again, I can't emphasize enough, we will give more of a structure to this at the May 23rd meeting. We will talk about the working groups, we will have some guidelines, and we will explain why these are important, so that people can sign up to work with one another. And along with that, I want to emphasize that the discussion board on the member website for LWV Ohio is operational. Please, log in there, add your comments. I monitor it, the advocacy portion. Don't be afraid to share what's going on locally. It's only for local leagues to talk to one another. Member to member, local league to local league. That's why it's in the member corner. So thank you all for coming tonight. And hopefully we'll see all of you on the 23rd. And Nikki, thanks for sending me the email. I got your email address. Thank you.
We'll listen to you next time.